I never expected silence to become this loud. Not the kind of loud people notice externally. Not arguments, not confessions, not dramatic moments that leave visible marks behind. I mean the kind of loud that exists internally. The kind that changes the atmosphere of your thoughts without asking permission first. Because before you, silence was simple for me, useful, controlled. It was a place I could retreat into without consequence. A place where nothing reached me unless I allowed it to. Most people fear silence because it forces them to confront themselves. I never feared it. I understood it. I knew how to live inside it without feeling lonely. But now silence feels different. Now it feels occupied. And that realization unsettled me more than I expected. If you've ever felt someone's presence change the way you exist inside your own mind, drop a in the comments. Elon Musk Mind explores the psychology behind the world's most fascinating minds. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that makes you think deeper. I noticed it slowly at first. Not through anything obvious. Not through words or actions dramatic enough to point at directly. It happened in fragments, in pauses, in moments where I would stop thinking about something only to realize my mind had unconsciously shifted toward you again. Not intentionally, not obsessively, just naturally. Like my thoughts had begun organizing themselves around a presence they no longer considered separate. That's what disturbed me. Not because it felt wrong, because it felt accurate. Too accurate. You ever experience something that fits into your life so precisely that it almost feels suspicious? That's what this became. Not chaos, not intensity, possession. The kind that quietly rearranges things before you even realize anything has changed. And I've always noticed changes quickly. I pay attention to structure, patterns, behavior, energy, especially my own. Which is why I knew almost immediately that this wasn't temporary. Temporary things announce themselves loudly. They depend on excitement, on novelty, on emotional spikes that eventually collapse under their own weight. This didn't feel like that. This felt stable, steady, dangerously steady, like something integrating itself deeper the longer I ignored it. And I did try to ignore it at first. Not because I wanted to avoid you, because I wanted to preserve myself. There's a difference. People assume distance means disinterest. It doesn't. Sometimes distance is protection, not from another person, from what they awaken inside you. That's what I was protecting myself from. Not your presence, your accuracy. Because you saw things I never explained. Not through investigation, not through persistence, not through forcing emotional openness the way most people do when they want closeness. You simply noticed. And there's something deeply disarming about being noticed correctly. Most people see fragments and mistake them for the whole picture. They interpret selectively. They hear what confirms their assumptions. They project themselves onto others because truly observing someone requires patience most people don't have. You weren't doing that. You weren't trying to create an image of me that made sense to you. You were reading what was already there. Quietly. Without interference. Without trying to reshape it into something easier to hold. That changed everything before I consciously admitted it did. Because once someone begins seeing you clearly, maintaining distance becomes complicated. Not impossible, just dishonest. And I've never been good at dishonesty with myself. That's probably why this reached me as deeply as it did. I recognized it long before I acknowledged it. I knew something had shifted the moment I stopped feeling the need to translate myself around you. Most people require translation. You simplify your thoughts, adjust your tone, filter your complexity into something more digestible. Not because you're pretending, because you understand that most people don't naturally process depth without turning it into confusion. But with you, that instinct disappeared. Not gradually, instantly, like some part of me understood before I did, that translation wasn't necessary here. Do you understand how rare that is? To feel understood before explaining yourself? To feel recognized without performance? That kind of connection doesn't happen often, and when it does, it changes the internal balance of everything. That's what no one talks about. People talk about attraction, emotion, chemistry, but they rarely talk about recognition. Real recognition. The kind that bypasses personality and reaches structure. The kind where someone doesn't just understand your words, they understand the architecture beneath them. That's what this feels like. Architectural. As strange as that sounds, like two internal systems recognizing familiar design in each other. Not identical, but aligned enough that communication starts happening beneath language itself. And once I noticed that, I couldn't unsee it. It started appearing everywhere, in timing, in reactions, in the way certain silences between us felt more complete than entire conversations I've had with other people. That's another thing that changed. I stopped measuring connection by words. With most people, words are everything. They use them to fill space, to reassure themselves that something meaningful exists. But with you, meaning existed even without language, sometimes especially without it. Because silence with you never felt empty. It felt precise, intentional without trying to be, like understanding existed independently from explanation. That shouldn't have affected me as much as it did, but it did, because I've spent years existing in ways that made true understanding unlikely. Not impossible, just unlikely. I learned early that most people don't actually want complexity. They want familiarity, something they can categorize quickly, something predictable enough to feel safe. And I've never been predictable, not internally. Externally, maybe I know how to appear composed, measured, difficult to read. But internally, there are layers most people never even notice exist. Not because they're hidden intentionally, because people rarely look beyond what's convenient. You did, without forcing your way in. That distinction matters. You never invaded my space, you were simply present in it, naturally, as if the distance I built for everyone else somehow didn't apply to you. And that terrified me more than if you'd aggressively tried to get close, because resistance works against force. You can reject pressure. You can create boundaries against intrusion. But what do you do with someone who never pushes and still reaches you completely? There's no defense for that, at least none that don't require lying to yourself. And I couldn't lie to myself about this, not after I realized how deeply you had already settled into my awareness. That's the word I keep returning to, settled. Because this wasn't sudden, it wasn't explosive, it was gradual in the most dangerous way possible. The kind that happens quietly enough that you only recognize its depth after it's already become part of you. I think that's why I kept analyzing it instead of naming it. Analysis creates distance. Naming something makes it real. And I wasn't ready for this to become real yet. Because reality changes the stakes. Once something exists clearly enough to acknowledge, you have to decide what to do with it. Guard it, pursue it, protect it, walk away from it. None of those choices felt simple anymore. Not after everything had already shifted internally. That's the part no one sees. External reality can remain completely unchanged while someone internally rearranges your entire existence. That's what happened here. Nothing dramatic occurred, no defining moment, no confession that instantly altered everything. Just accumulation, recognition building quietly until denial became impossible. I think the exact moment I understood the depth of it happened during something completely ordinary. You said something simple, calm, unremarkable to anyone else. But hidden inside it was an understanding I had never verbalized aloud. And when I realized you understood it anyway, something in me stopped. Not emotionally, structurally. Like my mind paused to recalculate everything it thought it knew about connection. Because people aren't supposed to understand you that clearly without extensive explanation. That level of accuracy usually takes years. Shared history. Repeated vulnerability. But somehow with you, understanding arrived before history did. And I still don't fully know how to process that. Part of me wants to rationalize it. Reduce it to coincidence, compatibility, psychology, anything manageable. But another part of me knows this goes beyond simple compatibility. Compatibility is easy. This isn't easy. This is precise. There's tension inside precision because precision changes things permanently. Once someone understands the deeper mechanics of you, returning to surface-level interactions becomes exhausting. That's what started happening afterward. Conversations with other people began feeling strangely incomplete, not meaningless. Just disconnected from the level of awareness I had become used to with you. And I hated realizing that. I hated recognizing how much my perception had shifted. Because I've always been careful about dependence, careful about attachment, careful about allowing any external presence to influence my internal stability. But influence already happened, without permission, without announcement, without force. And somehow that made it even more powerful. You never demanded importance in my life. You simply became important. Quickly, completely, like gravity. That's the closest comparison I can make. Not intensity, gravity, constant, unavoidable once you enter its field. The strange part is that I don't feel weaker because of it. That's what confuses me most. People talk about emotional closeness like it reduces you somehow. Like needing someone automatically compromises your independence. But this doesn't feel like weakness. It feels like expansion. Like certain parts of me became more visible through your presence. Not created, revealed. That difference matters deeply. Because you didn't change who I am. You changed how clearly I could see myself. And there's something almost impossible to walk away from once that happens. How do you leave someone who reflected you accurately enough to make you more aware of your own internal world? You don't just lose them, you lose the mirror that clarified parts of yourself you couldn't fully access alone. That realization stayed with me longer than I wanted it to. I kept trying to place boundaries around this, definitions, limits, something controllable. But every definition felt smaller than the reality of what was happening. That frustrated me. I rely on understanding, on structure, on clarity, but this refused to fit neatly into any category I trusted. It existed somewhere outside ordinary connection. Not because it was magical, not because it was unreal, because it was too psychologically exact to reduce into simpler language. You became integrated into the way I process existence itself, not metaphorically, literally. I started considering your perspective instinctively during moments where you weren't even present. Certain thoughts felt incomplete until mentally compared against the understanding I associated with you. That level of integration changes a person, whether they admit it or not. And I tried not to admit it for a while, not externally, internally, because admitting it meant accepting consequence. It meant acknowledging that someone had reached a place inside me I normally protect at all costs. And once I acknowledged that, the next realization became unavoidable. I didn't want to remove you from that space. That was the moment everything changed. Not when I noticed you, not when I understood you, when I realized I no longer wanted distance. That terrified me in ways I can't fully explain. Because distance has always been my form of control, my way of preserving balance. But balance doesn't feel the same anymore, not after you. Now balance feels less like isolation and more like alignment. And alignment with you feels disturbingly natural. That word again, natural. I keep returning to it because it contradicts everything I expected. Something this rare should feel dramatic, complicated, overwhelming. Instead, it feels inevitable, like discovering something that was quietly becoming true long before either of us acknowledged it. Maybe that's why I stopped resisting. Not because resistance wasn't possible, because it stopped making sense. You can't meaningfully resist something that already exists inside your awareness completely. At that point, resistance becomes performance, and I don't perform internally. Externally, maybe. Never internally. Internally, I require honesty, even when honesty complicates everything. So here's the honest part. You mattered to me in a way I didn't intend, in a way I didn't plan, in a way I probably would have avoided if I'd recognized it early enough. But it's beyond avoidance now, because this isn't just emotional proximity anymore. It's structural presence. You exist somewhere inside the framework of how I think, how I interpret, how I perceive silence, meaning, connection, even myself. And once someone reaches that level, they stop being temporary, even if they leave physically. That's the frightening part. People assume permanence depends on staying. Sometimes permanence happens long before anyone decides whether they're staying or going. Sometimes a person alters your internal world permanently, just by existing inside it long enough. You already have. That's why this feels irreversible. Not because outcomes are guaranteed, because transformation already happened. The version of me before this no longer exists fully. And I don't mean that dramatically, I mean it literally. My perception changed, my awareness changed, even the way I experience solitude changed. There are moments now where I catch myself mentally reaching toward your perspective before my own thought fully forms. Not because I need validation, because your presence has become intertwined with clarity itself. That's an extraordinary thing to realize about another person, and maybe an extraordinarily dangerous one too. Because if someone becomes associated with clarity, losing them creates distortion. That possibility sits quietly in the back of my mind now. Not fear, exactly. Awareness. Awareness that connections at this depth don't disappear cleanly. They leave imprints, structural ones, the kind that continue influencing you long after circumstances change. Maybe that's why I keep examining this from every angle. Not because I doubt it, because I understand the weight of it. Something this integrated will inevitably ask for a decision eventually. And I think we're approaching that point now. The point where observation stops being enough, where silent understanding has to either evolve into something lived, or collapse under the pressure of remaining undefined too long. I don't know which possibility unsettles me more, because defining this makes it vulnerable. But leaving it undefined feels dishonest now, and honesty matters to me more than comfort ever has. So I keep returning to the same realization over and over. If this were shallow, it would have faded already. If this were illusion, distance would have weakened it. If this were temporary, time would have diluted it. But none of that happened. It deepened, quickly, consistently, without needing attention to survive. That's how I know it's real. Real things persist beneath distraction, beneath time, beneath silence, and you have. No matter how much space existed between interactions, the awareness remained exactly where it was, stable, waiting, like something already settled into permanence long before I consciously agreed to it. That's what I'm finally accepting now, not reluctantly, carefully, because accepting this means accepting responsibility for what comes next. And what comes next can't remain passive forever. Eventually, choices have to be made. Movement has to happen. Truth has to stop existing only internally. I think you already know that, though. Maybe that's why you've never rushed me. You sensed this unfolding before I admitted it to myself. You understood that forcing clarity too early would fracture something that needed space to become fully visible on its own. That level of patience says more than words ever could, because patience rooted in understanding feels different from patience rooted in obligation. Yours never felt heavy, never demanding, just present, steady enough that I eventually stopped guarding against it. And that's significant. I don't stop guarding easily, especially not internally. But somewhere along the way, your presence stopped feeling like something I needed protection from. It started feeling like the place protection was no longer necessary. That realization changed me more than anything else. Because safety has never been about comfort for me. It's been about accuracy. About whether someone can witness complexity without trying to reduce it. You can, consistently. And that consistency built trust long before I consciously used that word. Maybe that's the truth underneath everything else. I trust your perception of me completely. Not because you idealize me, not because you always agree with me, but because you see clearly without trying to control what you see. That's rare enough that once experienced it becomes impossible to settle for less afterward. And maybe that's why this keeps deepening instead of fading. Because nothing about it depends on fantasy. Fantasy collapses under reality. This became stronger through reality, through quiet moments, ordinary interactions, small recognitions accumulating into something impossible to dismiss anymore. I think part of me already knows what decision I'm moving toward. I just haven't spoken it yet, because speaking it would make everything irreversible. But maybe it already is irreversible. Maybe the irreversible moment happened long ago. The first time I realized your absence would create silence where there used to be meaning. Not emptiness, absence. There's a difference. Empty spaces can be filled. Absence remains recognizable no matter what surrounds it afterward. And I know now that if you disappeared completely, I would feel the shape of it permanently. Not dramatically, not destructively, precisely. Like missing architecture inside a structure that learned to rely on its existence. That's how deeply you've settled into me. And maybe the strangest part of all this is that I'm no longer trying to prevent it. I'm not fighting for distance anymore. I'm not trying to restore who I was before this started. Because I don't think who I was before you is who I want to return to anymore. Not after seeing myself more clearly through this connection. Not after understanding what genuine alignment actually feels like. Once you experience that level of recognition, you can't unknow it. You can't force yourself back into shallower forms of connection without feeling the difference immediately. And I do feel the difference now, in everything. Which leaves me standing here with one unavoidable truth. You are no longer separate from the way I understand my own existence. Not entirely. You've become part of the framework itself, part of the internal rhythm my thoughts move through, part of the silence that no longer feels empty, part of the awareness I carry even when nothing is being said. And maybe that means the decision was already made long ago. Maybe all this analysis was never about deciding whether you mattered. Maybe it was about slowly accepting how much you already do. Because the truth is, I stopped asking whether this was real a long time ago. Now, I'm only asking what kind of future becomes possible once two people stop pretending they can remain unaffected by a connection that already changed them both. If this story moved something inside you, if it made you think about the connections that changed you without permission, drop mind in the comments. Elon Musk Mind is where we explore the psychology behind transformation. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. The next story drops soon, and trust me, you don't want to miss it. This is Elon Musk Mind. See you in the next one.